Master 55 key real estate acronyms every agent and investor should know. MLS, which means Multiple Listing Service, a database of properties for sale. For example, the agent listed the home on the MLS to reach more buyers. HOA, which means Homeowners Association, an organization that manages common areas and rules in a community. For instance, Susan pays a monthly fee to her HOA for lawn maintenance. FSBO, which means for sale by owner, when a homeowner sells their property without an agent. For example, Frederick decided to sell his house FSBO to avoid paying commission. CMA, which means Comparative Market Analysis, a report that estimates a property's value based on similar sales. For instance, the agent prepared a CMA to suggest the best listing price. ROI, which means Return on Investment, a measure of profitability. For example, investors look for properties with a strong ROI. FHA, which means Federal Housing Administration, a government agency that insures mortgages. For instance, first-time buyers often choose FHA loans for lower down payments. VA, which means Veterans Affairs Loan, a mortgage option for military service members and veterans. For example, Michael used a VA loan to buy his first home with no down payment. USDA, which means U.S. Department of Agriculture Loan, a loan program for rural properties. For instance, Sarah qualified for a USDA loan when buying her farmhouse. ARM, which means Adjustable Rate Mortgage, a loan with interest rates that can change over time. For example, the borrower chose an ARM because of its lower initial rate. PITI, which means Principal, Interest, Taxes, and Insurance, the four parts of a monthly mortgage payment. For instance, the lender calculated the buyer's PITI to check affordability. LTV, which means Loan-to-Value Ratio, the percentage of the loan compared to the property's value. For example, a higher down payment lowers the LTV ratio. PMI, which means Private Mortgage Insurance, insurance required when a buyer has less than 20% down. For instance, she had to pay PMI because she only put 5% down. REO, which means Real Estate Owned, property owned by a bank after foreclosure. For example, investors often buy REO properties at discounted prices. BPO, which means Broker Price Opinion, an estimate of property value given by a broker. For instance, the lender ordered a BPO instead of a full appraisal. NAR, which means National Association of Realtors, a trade group for licensed real estate professionals. For example, John is a member of the NAR and follows its code of ethics. NOI, which means Net Operating Income, income from a property after expenses are deducted. For instance, investors calculate NOI to evaluate rental properties. CAP, which means Capitalization Rate, the ratio of NOI to property value used to measure returns. For example, a higher CAP rate usually means higher risk and reward. GRM, which means Gross Rent Multiplier, a measure comparing property price to rental income. For instance, the duplex had a GRM of 12, making it a solid investment. CRE, which means Commercial Real Estate, property used for business purposes. For example, she specializes in CRE such as office buildings and retail centers. LOI, which means Letter of Intent, a preliminary agreement before a formal contract. For instance, the buyer submitted an LOI to show serious interest. CO, which means Certificate of Occupancy, issued by local government to confirm a property is safe to live in. For example, the builder couldn't hand over the keys until the CO was issued. EMD, which means earnest money deposit, money put down to show serious intent to buy. For instance, the buyer gave a $5,000 EMD along with the offer. HUD, which means U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, a federal housing agency. For example, HUD homes are often sold at affordable prices. ROI, which means return on investment, the gain or loss relative to the money invested. For instance, the investor analyzed ROI before flipping the property. CMA, which means comparative market analysis, used by agents to set a listing price. For example, the CMA showed that similar homes sold for $250,000. CCNR, which means covenants, conditions, and restrictions, rules governing a subdivision or HOA. For instance, the CCNR prevent homeowners from building sheds in the backyard. Deed, which means a legal document that transfers property ownership. For example, the deed was signed and recorded at the county office. Title, which means legal ownership rights to a property. For instance, the buyer received clear title after closing. Escrow, which means a neutral third party that holds funds until all conditions of a sale are met. For example, the buyer's deposit was kept in escrow until closing. APR, which means annual percentage rate, the total yearly cost of borrowing including interest and fees. For instance, the mortgage had an APR of 6.2%. DTI, which means debt-to-income ratio, a calculation of monthly debt compared to income. For example, lenders prefer a DTI below 43%. REIT, which means Real Estate Investment Trust, a company that owns and operates income-producing real estate. For instance, investors bought shares in a REIT for passive income. FIRPTA, which means Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act, a law requiring tax withholding when foreigners sell U.S. property. For example, the buyer withheld funds under FIRPTA regulations. Zoning, which means local government rules on how land can be used. For instance, zoning laws restricted the property to residential use only. GFE, which means good faith estimate, a disclosure of estimated closing costs. For example, the lender provided a GFE within 3 days of application. TRID, which means TILA-RESPA Integrated Disclosure, rules combining mortgage disclosures. For instance, TRID ensures borrowers clearly understand loan terms. CMA, which means comparative market analysis, a pricing tool for agents. For example, the seller relied on the CMA to set the asking price. FICO, which means a credit score used by lenders to assess risk. For instance, a high FICO score helped him qualify for a better rate. PMI, which means private mortgage insurance, protecting lenders against default. For example, PMI was required because the buyer put only 10% down. HECM, which means home equity conversion mortgage, another term for a reverse mortgage. For instance, seniors use HECMs to tap into their home's equity. FRM, which means fixed-rate mortgage, a loan with a stable interest rate. For example, the buyer chose an FRM for predictable payments. JV, which means joint venture, a partnership for a specific real estate project. For instance, 2 developers formed a JV to build a new apartment complex. NOI, which means net operating income, income minus expenses. For example, the property had an NOI of $50,000 per year. CMA, which means comparative market analysis, estimating property value. For example, agents prepare CMAs to support pricing recommendations. MLS, which means multiple listing service, database of homes for sale. For example, most buyers find homes through MLS listings. As is, which means property sold in current condition without repairs. For example, the seller listed the house as is after a fire. BPO, which means broker price opinion, valuation by a broker. For example, the lender ordered a BPO before foreclosure. NNN, which means triple net lease, where tenant pays taxes, insurance, and maintenance. For example, the retail tenant signed a NNN lease. CAM, which means common area maintenance, tenant's share of upkeep costs. For example, the office lease included monthly CAM charges. GRM, which means gross rent multiplier, comparing purchase price to rent. For example, the GRM was 11, making it attractive for investors. NOI, which means net operating income, rental income after expenses. For example, the property produced an NOI of $80,000 annually. LC, which means letter of credit, a guarantee of payment from a bank. For example, the landlord requested an LC from the tenant. PUD, which means planned unit development, a community with mixed housing and shared spaces. For example, buyers like PUDs for their parks and pools. RFI, which means request for information, used in construction and development projects. For example, the builder submitted an RFI to clarify specifications. CREC, which means Colorado Real Estate Commission, regulates real estate in Colorado. For example, agents in Colorado must be licensed through the CREC.